formation in the late 90s, the gentleman who was running that program at the time said this. He said, if you want to learn how to serve the poor, this program is a place where you can learn that. And I wasn't considering becoming a deacon at the time, but when I heard those words, I thought, you know, I help in the parish. I have a pretty healthy prayer life, I think, but when I read the Gospels, it seems to me that that's something that I'm missing, that I am not spending much time serving the poor. And if this program can help me get there, I'm interested in that. And so I entered formation. And shortly after I entered formation, I read an article. The title of the article was, How to Turn Your Lukewarm Parish into a Hotbed of Social Justice. And I read that article thirstily, and subsequently met the author of that article, who is here with us tonight, Jack Jezreel. Jack has a master's in divinity from Notre Dame. He served in a Catholic worker community for several years in Colorado, serving the homeless population there. And like many of us in ministry, he underwent a sort of a transformation where he realized that the important work really is in transforming hearts so that the message of social justice and the work of social justice can reach a wider variety of people. And that's when he began to work with parishes to establish social justice ministries at the ground, the base level. So Jack has been doing that work for several years through the JustFaith Ministries, which there are participants in that program here in Idaho. He lives in Louisville, where I went to college for a short period of time, semi-successfully. But so I'm pleased to be the one to introduce Jack Jezreel.
Well, good evening. I've actually never competed with 6, 12, 18 bottles of wine on the wall. So I just thought, well, maybe we just pass it around and have drinking songs in the middle or something. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be with you. Just by way of maybe adding a little bit to the intro, thank you very much. The work of JustFaith Ministries was really prompted by some early experiences that I had. I studied theology for 7 years, and then came out and spent the next 6 years of my life in a Catholic worker community, basically working with homeless men and women, most of whom had either mental illness or kind of substance abuse issues. And I often reflect back on those 13 years to say I had, 7 years of formal theological education in the classroom, and then I had 6 years of formal education on the street. And it was a perfect mixture for me. And one of the things that I recognized after those 13 years and went back into parish work was how siloed the work of social mission had become, or it was, in most parishes. And there is a phrase that I think most of you in this room have heard before. The phrase goes something like this: Catholic social teaching, our best kept secret. Right? A book that came out in the 70s talking about Catholic social teaching and describing the fact that for most Catholics at that time, and I would argue probably still today, Catholic social teaching is still unfamiliar vocabulary. And the reason it's unfamiliar vocabulary has been my experience is that most catechetical tools, for example, are in some ways absent of Catholic social teaching. There's little to notice about Catholic social mission in most educational materials that come out in most parishes. The point being that for most of us, and maybe even for some of us here tonight, the language, the architecture, the best expressions of, the best practices of social mission are largely unfamiliar to most of us. And one of the most telling pieces of data that suggests that that's true is if I say the phrase Catholic relief services, How many of you know that phrase? Right? Now, because the Catholic Relief Services is a powerful, remarkable, potent force of the U.S. Catholic bishops in all over the world in 100 countries, right? And guess what percentage of the Catholic population can identify what Catholic Relief Services is in this country? About 10%. 10. And the point being, at least from my perspective, is if you did know about Catholic Relief Services, and if you knew something about its work and how powerful it's been all over the world, it would make you proud to be Catholic. And all this is just to say, my brothers and sisters, that the work of JustFaith Ministries that came out of this, 13 years in the classroom and on the road, has really been about trying to bridge the gap between formation, spiritual formation, religious education, and the work of social mission. Now, with that said, let me tell you in some ways what is the operative and key element of our work. And it's really this one insight. When we talk about the church's social mission, frequently in a church like this, we think about it as something we're going to do after we leave here. Right? So, for example, if you work in a soup kitchen, you'll leave here and go out there to do it. In other words, when we think about homelessness, it's something we do out there. We think about human trafficking, it's something that needs to be done out there. We think about affordable housing, it's something that needs to be done out there. And of course, all that makes perfect sense, and it's true, but here's the point. My brothers and sisters, nothing happens out there unless something happens in here. Period. And so, as we talk about the church's social mission, understand that it's most fundamentally about your heart, your soul, and your spirit. It's fundamentally about spirituality. And how is it that you integrate and understand a relationship with the God who birthed us all? And so social mission is not primarily about economics. It has economic connections. It's not primarily connected to politics. It's certainly linked. Its fundamental, primary connection is with the God that we understand and experience inside here. And I have said this before, and it might be the most provocative thing I say tonight, but my brothers and sisters, to the extent that we can go to church, we can pay attention, we can go to Bible studies and religious ed classes, and to the extent that we can come out of those experiences and not be interested in the welfare of the poorest of the poor, in people who are watching their children starve, is an indictment of the religious education tools that we're using. Now, that's the strongest thing I'm going to say tonight. I'll say some more provocative things, and I'll explain why in just a second. Before I start, though, let me just say two things. First, because I've been doing this work for a long time, and I've met a lot of crabby people, I just want to mention that in his apostolic exhortation, Joy the Gospel, Pope Francis uses a word that no pope has ever used before. The Pope introduces a brand new word into the Catholic lexicon. This is what the Pope says. Those who would follow Christ may not be sourpusses. It's true. It's there. Now, you know why I say this, don't you? How many people have you known who are committed to social mission, committed to righting all wrongs, and are just kind of crabby, right? And here's the point. And by the way, it's in the spirit. We might as well just get this out on the open. Everybody here probably knows the AA tradition, right? You walk into the room and you just name your brokenness at the start. You say, "My name's Jack, and I'm an alcoholic." I'm not an alcoholic, but that's the way it starts. You walk in, you say, "I'm Jack, and I'm a sinner," right? So just so that we get it out on the open, how many people here are sourpusses? My name's Jack and I'm a sourpuss. What? There's no sourpusses in the room? Okay, how about this? How many of you have sourpuss capacity? All right, we should have started with the kind of question you asked. Okay, here's the serious point. My brothers and sisters, I mean, this is part of it. It seems to me that the grounding, the foundation of our work, can't be anger over injustice. Now, there is an appropriate place for anger about injustice, but the starting point is something different. And I would argue the starting point is with the most fundamental of Christian prayer. In fact, it might not even have to be a Christian prayer. It can be any kind of prayer that acknowledges this. That the most fundamental prayer that each one of us ought or does pray every day is this prayer. Oh, good, I woke up. And what do I mean by that? Is that when you wake up, you realize, I'm getting another day. Right? You wake up, you've got another gift of another day. And the reason I raise this up, just to remind us, it's a little bit of a sobering thought, but it's true, that last night, just last night, tens of thousands of people all over this globe did not wake up. They didn't wake up. Now, some of them died peacefully at an old age in their sleep. And there's no tragedy to that. It hurts, but there's no tragedy to it. And there are others, though, whose lives were lost because they didn't have enough food or because bombs came down in the middle of the night. And of course, that's all tragic. But here's the point. If you wake up, you get another day. And it is completely a gift. Whether you're Christian or not, or religious or not, every one of us has to acknowledge the fact that this life is just a gift. You didn't apply for it. You didn't earn it. It was just given. And so then you wake up, and the first thing you notice is how good the warm bed felt and how little you want to get out of it. Right? But you throw off the covers and you run to the shower, and there's this warm water on your back, and you think, oh my gosh, that's great. And then after the warm shower, and you put on clothes, and then there's coffee. And there's breakfast, and you can taste food. And if you live with somebody you can hug or kiss, children to enjoy, right? And you look outside and there's a sky, and everywhere, including Boise especially, the sky is always different. It's always different. And you can see color. We can see each other. I need your hand. You can touch, right? You can feel, right? You can think. You can think thoughts, right? You can feel meaning. We even believe we can feel the presence of the Lord in our lives. And all of it's miracle, right? All of it's a wonder. We ought to wake up and just think, oh my gosh, another one, another gift. And here's the point. If you recognize life as a gift, remember the first book of our Bible is nothing but about the great giving of the gift. If you recognize that life is a gift, then there are two responses that flow out of that. And the first, of course, is gratitude. Thanksgiving, Eucharist. The first is gratitude. My brothers and sisters, sometimes people say people who are happy are grateful. It's just the opposite. People who are grateful are happy. And if you don't have much and you're grateful, you can be happy. And if you have a lot, if you have everything and you're not grateful, you can't be happy. That's the first response, is gratitude. And it allows us to, in some way, celebrate Eucharist. And the second is this. The second is generosity. Because as soon as you recognize life as a gift, guess what the only purpose of it is? To give it away. Let the gift flow on. Now, my brothers and sisters, I think I could fairly summarize all of Jesus' teachings in those two notions. That life is a gift, for which we should be grateful, with which we give away. And that the discipleship, the practice of discipleship is essentially, how do I on a daily basis give my life away back to God and to my brothers and sisters? And the point is, we start with joy. All of this is about joy. So the beginning point of this work, and over the course of the next couple of days, we're going to hear some very difficult, challenging things about a lot of realities in this world that are very hard to take in. And about the only way we can do it, number one, is with joy, and number two, is with each other. About the only way to maintain the joy is to do this as the body of Christ. This is not for solo artists. This is not for single people. This is for, singular people. It's for single people too. But it's for us together, okay? So that's the first thing I want to emphasize, is we should see smiling faces in the room, so I don't want anybody scowling at me. Or I'll just excuse you. Number two. So with joy. Number two. I've assumed tonight it's 7 o'clock. For some of us, it's 9 o'clock. You've worked, many of you worked all day. You're looking at the wine, you're thinking that, I hope he hurries up. So I assume tonight that rather than being anesthetized early, that you would rather be nudged and challenged and provoked a bit. So I'm just going to admit to you right now that I'm going to use the tool called hyperbole. Does everybody know what that is? It means the deliberate use of exaggeration to make a point. So I'm going to speak in exaggerated terms in order to, in some ways, jostle us a little bit, so that over the course of the next couple of days we can reimagine, refresh our identities as a baptized people. Okay? And I just want you to know that it's coming. Okay? I'm posturing myself as the out-of-town provoker. Okay? And I just want, so when things really jostle, just hang on for a while and let them sort of bounce around inside you a bit. Okay? And I'm not doing this because I just like to provoke people. I'm really doing it because I want us to use our imaginations, because I think Pope Francis is asking us to use our imaginations. Okay? Everything so far, I haven't even started yet. I'm just getting us ready. Okay, I want to start, however, with a story that I first heard read by a bishop in Kansas City. His name was Bishop John Sullivan. And Bishop John Sullivan was welcoming a large institute about this size in Kansas City. And I had traveled from Colorado Springs to Kansas City to be a part of this. And he read this story. And he entitled it, The Parable of the Parish, which is kind of interesting because the word parish actually never shows up in the story. But as I read the story, just know that it's about the parish, and then you can laugh or you can cry depending upon your perspective. And here's how the text goes. I've got a lot of it memorized, so let's see how I do here. The Parable of the Parish. On a dangerous seacoast, where shipwrecks often occur, there was once a crude little life-saving station. The building was just a hut, and there was only one boat. But the completely devoted members kept a constant watch over the sea. How do I turn this on? I want you to have this only scintillating image I have in the entire presentation. Perfect. So that's a life-saving station. And with no thought for themselves, they went out day and night, tirelessly searching for the lost, and many were saved by this station, and it became famous. And some of those who were saved and others in the surrounding area wanted to give their time and money and effort for the support of its work. So new boats were bought, the crews were trained, the little life-saving station grew. Now some members of the life-saving station were still unhappy that the building was so crude and so poorly equipped. They felt that a more comfortable place should be provided as the first refuge of those saved from the sea, so they replaced the cots with beds. They put better furniture in, they enlarged it to a more elaborate building, and now the life-saving station became a popular gathering place for its members, who were proud of it. And they redecorated it beautifully and furnished it exquisitely because they came to use it as a kind of club. You could laugh at that one. As it turned out, fewer, and then fewer, and then even fewer of the members remained interested in going to sea on life-saving missions, so instead they hired lifeboat crews to do this work. Now the life-saving motif still prevailed in the club decorations, however, and there was a liturgical lifeboat in the room where club initiations were held. Good. People are chuckling. You're getting it. About this time, a large ship was wrecked off the coast, and the hired crews brought in boatloads of cold, wet, half-drowned people. They were dirty and wounded and sick, and some had differently colored skin. And the property committee immediately had a shower house built outside of the club where the victims of shipwreck could be cleaned up before coming inside. At the next meeting, there was a split in the club membership. Most of the members wanted to stop the club's activities of life-saving as being somewhat beneath them and an unpleasant hindrance to the normal social life of the club. Other members insisted that they were known as a life-saving station, that life-saving was their primary purpose. But they were finally voted down and told that if they wanted to save all the various kinds of people with different colors of skin and strange languages and odd religions who were shipwrecked on those waters, they could start their own life-saving station down the coast. So they did. They were called Franciscans. No. But as the years went by, the same changes that had occurred in the old station now occurred in the new station. And yet another life-saving station was started. They were called Lutherans. No, that's not. History continued to repeat itself. And if you visit that seacoast today, you will find a number of exclusive clubs along that shore. Shipwrecks are still frequent in those waters, but today, most of the people drown. The parable of the Parish. Now, I didn't make it up. And I'm sure that one of the reasons that Bishop Sullivan elected to tell it is a classic example of a cautionary tale. What can happen even to the best of organizations or institutions or movements that have at their original founding some kind of original generosity, some kind of original vision, some kind of original mission, some kind of original even sacrifice. But what happens over time is as generation upon generation upon generation gets some distance from that original mission, it finds itself at some distance from that original generosity, that original sacrifice, and that original mission that people found so compelling. Now, my brothers and sisters, one of the standard interpretations of what happened in Vatican II was not something new, but an effort to make available to the 20th and now 21st century the original mission and vision of the gospel, if you will. In other words, to make it more accessible to the larger church. So, for example, all of you, I think, are familiar with the RCIA or the catechumenate, right? And you might remember back in the late 70s and early 80s when the RCIA made its first appearance in your parish, right? And people were thinking to themselves, oh my gosh, a year just to become Catholic? My mother did it in 3 weeks. What are they going to think up next? And a lot of people thought it was this new thing, right? Turns out it wasn't a new thing, right? It's the oldest thing, right? Similarly, the topic of our gathering this week is not something new. It's not some new Vatican II idea. It's original mission, original vision. Right. And so, my brothers and sisters, we're going to be speaking to that integration. Now, I bring all this up because this transition, Vatican II. About 9 months ago, the Pope was hosting an audience with Catholic press. They were speaking in Italian. And one of the members of the press asked the Pope in Italian, what's your program here? Which meant, what are you up to? And the Pope didn't even pause for a second. He said, I hope to complete Vatican II. Now, a lot of the press said, well, that was 50 years ago. What complete what? And of course, you and I know that 50 years in church time is like an eye blink for a dog, right? In dog years. I mean, it just, 50 years is nothing. And so in some ways, it should not surprise us that something that happened 50 years hasn't come to full blossoming, full fruition. And that's what I'd like to speak to tonight, because my brothers and sisters, I think if you and I can frame ourselves to see where we are as a church in the 21st century, I think it helps a lot to see the transition and to be able to interpret Pope Francis and to see where the church might be going. And we're going to look at some very provocative quotes from Evangelization that speak to this very piece. Now, if I can just find the right... Okay, so what I want to speak to is from Vatican I to Vatican II, really not just a little tweaking around the edges, some real significant paradigm shifts. And that's what I would like to address. And the way I'd like to speak to this paradigm shift is using, and I have to use a brushstroke, right? We don't have, well, we do have 4 hours, don't we? I mean, we've got wine, okay, we're assuming you don't want to do that. I'm going to use a brushstroke approach, realizing it's imperfect. I'm just admitting that from the start. But I want to speak to this transition. And the way I'm going to do it is just to remind those of you who are at least as old as I am, how most of the church was theologically trained 50 years ago. And the tool, the ubiquitous tool, was the Baltimore Catechism, right? How many of you remember the Baltimore Catechism? Okay, put your hands down. And how many of you remember really, really well the Baltimore Catechism? And so what was the answer to question 120? Okay, not so good. But
I didn't raise my hand to be a sourpuss.
He was responding to the sourpuss question. Okay. So here's the question that's asked: is why did Christ institute the church? And the answer is given in a 3-infinitive phrase that you might remember. The response was the church's mission, the church's purpose, the reason for being, the church's work is to teach, to govern, and to sanctify. Everybody remember that phrase pretty well? That was one of the ones that the bishop was definitely going to ask us when we were in 5th grade at St. Cecilia's Catholic School in Clearwater, Florida, and so we had to be ready. So, the teach, to govern, and to sanctify. Now, through the lens of Vatican II, I have to craft my language here very carefully, but through the lens of Vatican II, there is a critique, if you will, of what was happening, which is why Vatican II happened. There was a sense of, kind of a restive sense that something fresh and new, there was some yearning for some kind of growth or imagination or movement. And through the lens of Vatican II, there's a couple of fine-tunings that have to happen to that definition, because, in effect, Vatican II asked 2 pivotal questions, if you will, about that definition, and found them not wrong, incomplete. Okay? Not wrong, but incomplete. Here's the first question. The first question that we might ask is, if the church's work is to teach, to govern, and to sanctify, then the question we might ask is, who are the ministers? The quick answer was, clergy. Right? Clergy taught, clergy governed, and clergy sanctified. Now, it would not behoove me to be offering you an anti-clerical comment. This is not anti-clerical. It's just a remark. That work was done, in many cases, in a superb fashion. Right? But here's the problem. If about 1% or less of the church, if you will, the Catholic Church, are the active agents of ministry, teaching, governing, and sanctifying, then the other 99% are the ones being ministered to. Now, is that bad? No. Here's the problem, though. If your only experience of church is to be the recipient of ministry and not the agent of ministry, then your response to church is largely receptive. That's not bad, but here it is, passive. In other words, when we talk about the Holy Day of obligation, what was the obligation? Show up to be ministered to, right? Now, through the lens of Vatican II, active ministry is not just associated with ordination, it's associated with what sacrament? Baptism. Who ministers? Everybody. Now, my brothers and sisters, I'll bet, was this church here 50 years ago? Okay, doesn't matter. If you were to have in your possession a parish bulletin from the nearest Catholic church that existed 50 years ago, May or June of 1965, and then look, I'll bet, at the bulletin of this parish, completely different. I mean, now the parish bulletins are like this thick. It's like the Sunday New York Times. You have to devote your afternoon to look at all the stuff that's going on, right? And inside this bulletin now, there's 146 ministries, right? Led by who? The baptized. Populated by who? The baptized. The parish has become a beehive of stuff going on. And parishes often grow. Parishes build. Not just to accommodate more people at Mass, but they're building classrooms left and right because there's not enough room for all the things that are going on. Are you with me? And I'll bet you know this experience well. Just to think about how many, for this example, how many opportunities there were there for adults in 1965 to study their Catholic faith in your parish. It might have been none. Or it might have been what's called the seminary. No, I'm not trying to exaggerate. That's the truth. Okay? Okay. Now, so far so good. In other words, so far, the transition imagined by Vatican II, which was an active, engaged church in which people assumed by the power of baptism to be active agents of God's Word in the world. Here's a second question that gets asked by Vatican II. It's not who ministers, but actually geography. Where does ministry take place? If the definition is to teach, to govern, and sanctify, where does ministry take place? Parish property. Now, let me give you, this is playful. This is to keep you awake. When I was 8 years old, at St. Cecilia's Catholic School, going to St. Cecilia's Catholic Church, growing up in Clearwater, Florida, growing up in the 60s, so my family had what was called a station wagon, which was a football field with 4 wheels. And on top of being a football field, it had no seat belts. It was a great time to be a kid in a car. It was like a jungle gym, right? Unless you got into an accident, of course. And so, the minute we kids would get into our station wagon, all chaos broke loose. Of course, it starts with, "You touched me." And then it just went from there. And so we would pitch each other over seats because there was a third seat, like about 50 yards away. Anyway, so this is a Sunday morning, and again, remember this is playful, but I think you'll be able to relate to this. So Sunday morning we hop in the car. Sunday morning or Saturday morning, doesn't matter what morning it is, we hop in the car and all chaos breaks out immediately. So we're driving to church, we go by the high school, chaos in the back. We go by the dairy curl, chaos in the back. We go over the railroad tracks, chaos in the back. And then the right front tire touches the church parking lot. And because all my brothers and sisters and I went to St. Cecilia's Catholic School and we were taught by nuns, this is what we did immediately. Because you do not misbehave on this block. We got out of the car quietly, we walked behind Mom and Dad like this to the church, and then what happens, remember this is an eight-year-old boy. We go into this building, and like always, it's got these windows that you don't see anywhere else. We sit down, we kneel, we stand up, we do things we never do anywhere else. And we talk in a language we do not understand. But we know why, because God only speaks Latin. And then we do things in the church that we're not allowed to do anywhere else. There's smoke. We're not allowed to light anything in our house. But there's smoke in this building. And then, finally, there are women wearing hats that could not possibly balance on their head, except by some miraculous intervention. And all of this creates an understanding that God is here. God is here. And here's what happens. We leave Mass, we get back in the car, we're very quiet. The left front tire touches the road, and it's chaos all the way back home. And we didn't talk about religion in my family. We barely got anything other than bless us, the Lord, and these I guess out as a family. And so we never saw nuns on the beach. Where I live, I clear what I do. So in other words, the whole sense was God is on the block. And the way it was understood was the more time you spent on the block, the holier the Catholic you were. You see. And so there's this logic, that if you went to Mass every day, that's better than going just on Sunday. And if you go to reconciliation like every week instead of once every 3 months, that's even better. And if you're on church property painting parking lot lines, that's holy too. And it goes on. In other words, the logic was, how do we get people to this parish space? Now, that's playful, but it speaks to some truth, doesn't it? Right? And in contrast to that, through the lens of Vatican II, where does ministry take place? Everywhere. And one of the best indicators of that is near the end of liturgy, there is this theologically powerful, spiritually potent word. The spiritually powerful word is go. Now, not go because it's time for us to vacuum. It's a sending rite. And the sending rite is having experienced the presence of the living Lord amongst us in bread and wine. There's but one thing to be done, and that's to do as Jesus would do. Go do it. So this is what's happened. Let's pretend the altar's up there. For the last hour or so, our lives have been governed by the common understanding of what we do together at this prayer. We know the responses to the prayers. We know when to stand and kneel and sit. We know how to get in the communion line properly. And all this works great because it's great to have collective prayer, right? And then we're told to go. And so we turn around and we start to go to the exit doors. And this is what happens, whether we acknowledge it or recognize it or not, is we go to those doors, it's back to the station wagon. It's back to family, it's back to neighborhood, it's to a world of politics and economics, and as Bishop mentioned, a world that needs a lot of light and salt. It's a world in which, in this country, the richest country in the world, 1 in 5 kids live with food insecurity. It's a world in which about 1 billion people live in profound poverty. It's a world in which one of the largest growing businesses is human trafficking. It's a world in which, and you can just go through the long list of pains and wounds, and you realize at that point that you don't think that knowing when to kneel, stand, and sit is going to help you here. And what happens is our touchstones come out of the readings, out of the gospel, out of the scriptures, out of the witness of the church throughout history, out of the logic of Catholic social teaching and Catholic social mission, and the agency of compassion and justice and mercy and charity that have been the lived experiences. Those become the touchstones that I draw from as I move toward those doors. And here's the point. My brothers and sisters, remember that church that has now a bulletin this thick with 146 ministries in it? Guess where 144 of them meet? And guess what they're about? Now this is a big brushstroke. You see the transition. I would say, my brothers and sisters, sometimes I go to churches, and on the cover of their bulletin it'll say St. Mary's Catholic Church, and underneath it says a Vatican II community. And after I look at the bulletin and see that 144 of the 146 ministries are meeting on parish property and largely about the parish, I want to say, no, Vatican 1.5. In other words, the transition is still happening, and I think this is exactly the point, the Pope's message. Okay? So that's what I want to spend some time is now looking at Pope Francis's take on this. From Vatican I to Vatican II, a new paradigm, and what I want to suggest, using the Pope's language, it's a movement to a missional paradigm. I've got a couple of quotes. Does anybody have a good, strong voice who would stand up and read the first one for us, if you would? Does anybody have that kind of strong voice? Yes, sir. Would you do it? Sure. Here, why don't you read that one? You can start with a quote right at I want.
I want to emphasize that what I am trying to express here is a paradigmatic significance.
That's okay. I got
and
glasses.
important consequences. I hope that all communities will devote the necessary effort to advancing along the path of pastoral and missionary conversion, which I cannot leave things as they presently are.
Now you notice I highlighted a few words near the end there. In other words, the Pope is imagining, first of all, that joy of the gospel would actually have practical implications for the way parishes might work. Okay? Anybody else with a nice strong voice who'd be willing to read one for us? Yes, sir.
I dream of a missionary option, that is, a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world rather than for her self-preservation.
Transforming everything, a missionary option. Another strong voice, maybe a woman's voice? Yes, ma'am. Please.
The renewal of structures demanded by pastoral conversion can only be understood in this light as part of an effort to make them more mission-oriented, to make ordinary pastoral activity on every level more inclusive and open, to inspire in pastoral workers a constant desire to go forth, and in this way to elicit a positive response from all those whom Jesus summons to friendship with him. As John Paul II once said to the bishops of Oceania, all renewal in the church must have mission as its goal if it is not to fall prey to a kind of ecclesial introversion.
One more. By the way, one more. Yes, sir. Can you see? And this is in response to Vatican II. Go right ahead.
The parish is not an outdated institution. Precisely because it possesses great flexibility, it can assume quite different contours depending on the openness and missionary creativity of the pastor and the community. While certainly not the only institution which evangelizes, if it proves capable of self-renewal and constant adaptivity, it continues to be the church living in the midst of the homes of her sons and daughters. This presumes that it really is in contact with the homes and the lives of its people, and does not become a useless structure out of touch with people, or a self-absorbed cluster made up of a chosen few.
Let me just pause for a second and highlight a remarkable collection of words in this one text. Let me start with the third line, openness. Second line, and the line under that, creativity. A couple lines under that, self-renewal, adaptivity. Do you think the Pope has something in mind here? Right? Something being birthed. And then finally, I'll close by reading the last one. We must admit, and this is referencing the Second Vatican Council, we must admit, though, that the call to review and renew our parishes has not yet sufficed to bring them near to people, to make them environments of living communion and participation, and to make them completely mission-oriented. Completely mission-oriented. In other words, my brothers and sisters, when Francis uses the language of missionary disciple, or mission, or missional, or mission-oriented, he's talking about a church that finds a big chunk of its meaning by being off campus. That goes especially into the places where God's people cry out. He uses the language of getting smelly like the sheep. And he uses lots of language of talking about how the church should park itself, place itself, especially in the places where the wounds are. So what does it mean to become, if you will, a parish, a completely Vatican II parish that finds a big part of its power by dislocating itself putting itself in the wounded places so it can be light and leaven. And I suppose one way to say this, and this is rough, this is a little bit crude, not crude like rude, but rough. And that is this, my brothers and sisters, the church of my mother, the Vatican I church of my mother, where her devotion was to be on parish property. I don't want to demean that. But like Vatican II, I want to say it's incomplete. The church that Francis imagines is a church that, well, if we could say it this way, the church of my mother was the church of the sanctuary. And the church, if you look at the Gospels, the Jesus message is a message that gets communicated on the road. If you look at the Gospels through the lens of geography, Jesus is always moving all over the world. This is not a guy who stays put very long. He's got a proper respect for the sanctuary, but he doesn't spend a lot of time there. And so if you ask this question, was Jesus a sanctuary guy or a road guy? The answer would be, he's a road guy. And those who would follow Jesus will be road people. No, we will still find the sanctuary compelling, because that's where we gather as a community. That's where the body of Christ gathers and knows who it is. It celebrates its experiences on the road. So I have, for your consideration, some challenges going forth. And these are just my imagination. And remember, I'm the professional provoker. Okay? So just know it's coming. So here's what I think is in Francis's mind. Not only how do we equip people to be part of the sanctuary, but also, see the also word? But also how to equip people to heal and make holy the world. In other words, yes, come to church, but know that the task will be, how does St. Anne's Catholic Church heal the neighborhood, heal the city, heal the state, heal the country, heal the world, or whatever piece of it is ours to do. As subcategories of that. The logic of Vatican I was educational content was primarily about life in the church, on parish property, in our families, in our communities. And I think what Francis has in mind is also, how do we equip people to, or education being about the reality around us and the church's response in faith. Sacraments, a la Vatican I, were tools for belonging. Are you now a full participating member of this church? And I think what Francis has in mind is sacraments are not only about belonging to a community, but also about empowering people to be disciples of Jesus in the world, doing the stuff that needs to be done to heal the wounds and the brokenness. Evangelization has been historically largely about trying to get people to church, right? And there's still a lot of this in all of the churches, right? I think Francis is great about that. But also evangelization is about engaging people in the meaning and mission of Jesus. And if I could pause my slide for just a second to make this point. I was at a conference on youth ministry recently. And the speaker was talking about prototypical youth ministry. And I don't do a lot of work with youth, but I know a little bit about it. And he was talking about the usual pieces that go into youth ministry. And he said this. He said, so we have the budget for this, and then we have the budget for the optional summer mission. And then he said, the only thing that works. And then he went on. And his point was this. Jesus evangelizes like this. You're going to have to come with me if you want to understand. Jesus is healing, and he's doing this. He's not saying, I want you to gather around the table, talk about healing for a while, and then figure it out. It's, come with me. We're going to go do something. And then in that context, Jesus then explains what God is about. Before, after, and in the middle of it. Are you with me? In other words, evangelization is something that happens on the road, you see. At our parish, we have an urban retreat center, an urban immersion retreat center for young people. And what they do, they come from all over the city, and now they come from all over the country, because it's one of the few places like it, where young people are invited into the most broken places in Louisville, Kentucky, where I'm from. And they pray it, they discuss it, they open the Bible, and all of it comes alive. And when they leave, they're all different. And I bring this up, my brothers and sisters, partly because in my heart, which is heavy, I'm all too aware of all the official CARA data about the loss of young people in our church. And my brothers and sisters, if we keep doing what we've been doing, I don't know how that changes. So I think what Francis has in mind is, and this has been my experience, is that what young people hunger for is a God who's dynamic, a God who is doing important things in the world, a God whose finger they can see in the healing work of Catholic Charities and Catholic Relief Services and St. Vincent de Paul and scores of others. Young people have a heart for mission. And if we dismiss that, I fear they will continue to leave. Church going, as you know, has been largely about, in other words, where do you go to church? I go to this particular block called St. Mary's or St. Anne's or St. Michael's. And I think what Francis has in mind is church going is actually going from the church to the world. It's both and, right? It's both and I'm exaggerating the second piece of this just to make the point. Giving, historically, and this is a brushstroke, has primarily been focused on how do we build the next church building and pay for the church activities. And I think what Francis would like to see is giving is focused on addressing scarcity and need. We see that in his action. We see that in the priorities he has in his own budgeting. And my brothers and sisters, you know, I'm on record. You can go to YouTube and see the video of making this challenge to parishes. If we describe, if we can describe parish life as roughly divided in the gathering functions. In other words, when we gather on parish property for Eucharist and education and celebration and community, that's half of the Jesus story. And the other half of the Jesus story is sending people out to be light and loving in the world. Could we imagine a parish that had half of its budget dedicated to the gathering ministries, right? Eucharist, sacramental prep, youth ministry, adult education, and half of the parish staff dedicated to the sending ministries, linking people in critical relationships where they can heal the world locally, nationally, and internationally. And I'll just make this point that I worked at a parish where 10% of the budget is tithed to healing ministries. And it is the most controversial part of the parish. It always, as soon as the budget gets tight, the parish challenges whether we ought to be giving that 10% because the other 90% goes to the parish itself. If the emphasis of Vatican I has been on membership, then we want to combine that notion of being a member of something with discipleship, which means getting on the road. If leadership could be described, and I'm using both images here, as a dock manager, meaning the caretaker of people in the sanctuary, but we're not necessarily going anywhere, versus leadership as lifeboat captain, like the story I told, the caretaker of God's world, the people who are wounded in the ocean, and the leader of the crew that saves the people. Right? A kind of redefinition of what it means to be parish leader. And sometimes I ask folks the question. I sometimes do consultation with parishes, and I'll say, "Does your parish have a mission statement?" Oh, and they say, "Oh, yes, we have a beautiful mission statement." I say, "What is it?" And they say, "Well," and it goes something like this: "It is inspired by the Holy Spirit, and in walking in the footsteps of Christ, St. Anne's Catholic Church seeks to be a Eucharistic community that celebrates the sacrament, proclaims the Word," and I think, oh, that's beautiful. That's a vision statement. What I'm asking is, what is your parish trying to accomplish in 2015? Oh. What's the plan? What's the plan? One time I was giving a talk to RCIA directors in Chicago, and I was talking about the emphasis in the RCIA on human transformation, conversion. The RCIA keeps a kind of a watchful eye on our people changing as they encounter Christ in the process, right? And what are the touchstones for that? And in the rubrics of the RCIA, in preparation for Easter, it says the elect should demonstrate some concern for the poor. Okay. So I'm talking about this with the RCIA directors, and I'm talking about the language of conversion and the logic of conversion, a la Jesus Christ. And I was about 2/3 of the way through, and all of a sudden this hand popped up. This guy jumps out of his chair and he says, "Sir," I know whenever somebody says "sir," I'm not going to like the question. He says, "I just want you to know, for the last 45 minutes you've been talking about change and conversion and transformation." And he says, "I just want to tell you something. I've been a member of my parish for 47 years and I've never seen anybody change. And I'm a good Catholic." Now the point is, my brothers and sisters, why does a parish exist? I think for 2 reasons. To be an agent of transformation. A parish should change people's lives. And a parish should change the world. And those 2 things are linked. In other words, if your parish disappeared from the face of the earth tomorrow, would any poor people care? Would anybody who's in wounded places care? Because that would be a sign, that would be evidence that your parish is a potent, powerful, and important presence, inspired by the gospel to do what Jesus did in the world. Finally, parishes hang out, which is a good thing, to also, parish is a launching pad, right? It's a place we go to get launched to do the work that needs to be done. Now I have about 5 minutes left or so, and I just want to run through a couple of touchstones for us. And I was just thinking about, in this Catholic world, in which parishes perhaps have struggled to integrate social mission in a robust way. I'm not saying there aren't some great examples in every parish of people doing compassionate, merciful, just things. That's not my point. But just as a body, the language and logic of social mission is still largely underdeveloped. But in this Catholic world, we have, I would argue, the single most robust tradition of mercy, justice, and compassion that I know of in the world. And it expresses itself in everything from Catholic relief services to Catholic charities to St. Vincent de Paul to Respect Life and my brothers and sisters, if we had until midnight tonight and all I did was name the agencies around the world that are Catholic, that are addressing human crisis and human struggle and human poverty and human suffering, if I just named the names, it would take me till midnight to do that. And the point is that we have this robust, compassionate presence in the world, and what I want to do is say, so how is it that people get integrated into it, maintain a commitment to it? Where are the places where social witness has been very particularly potent? And one of the places is, and this is just one example, is religious communities. Right? Many of us in this room, at least those who are old as I am, were the beneficiaries of women and men who started schools for poor immigrant kids who had no other place to go. Many of us in this room are beneficiaries of hospitals built by women so that underserved, poor people could have access to health care, right? Many of us here in this room, maybe, are people who, when we were down and out, had a Catholic charities to go to that helped us get an education or helped us in between jobs, and we were able to move on because of that safety net called Catholic Charities. And I could go on and on and on. And one of the things I wanted to highlight are 4 commitments, it seems to me, of these religious communities that I wanted to share with you before I close in just a couple of minutes. Number 1, these critical characteristics of sustained commitment. And I started with the one that is, I think, Francis's favorite, voluntary dislocation. And what the geography of missionary discipleship is to put ourselves where the wounds are. You see, one of the brilliant insights of Francis He doesn't start talking about issues that divide people up into left or right or conservative or liberal. That's not the point. You start by being